Recording. Okay. Well, as usual, I forgot to put my little clicker in. I don't know why it's so hard for me to remember that. Okay, so today we are going to start a new letter. It feels kind of odd to not be talking about Hebrews. Can anybody tell me how many weeks we spent on Hebrews? Just take a wild guess. Or how many lessons, how many sessions, whatever. Anybody? Bueller? Bueller?
24.
How
30.
much?
30.
24.
30, 34. You're pretty close. It was 26. We spent literally a half a year on Hebrews. And of course, we had several breaks. We had holy days and the feast. And so we started it on February the 22nd, 40 weeks ago. And we averaged over 2 hours a week. So we spent about 56 hours studying the book of Hebrews. And I want to tell you, folks, I learned more in that study than any other 26 weeks of my life, I think. Thanks to you all and all the discussion and the research I was able to do because of word search software and so on. But it's time to move on. So today's study is going to be an introduction to the Epistle of James, or the Epistle of whoever wrote it. And we'll get to that a little bit later. So who is this man, James, who wrote this epistle? Put another way, which James wrote this epistle? Now, there is a lot of, I don't know if disagreement is the right term, but a lot of scholars, a lot of commentaries go in a little bit different directions. What I've done today is try to take the consensus of the research that I did, finding out who wrote the book and when it was written and all that kind of stuff. Because as with a lot of letters in the New Testament, in the Greek scriptures, there's disagreement. So if you all have a different date or a different, whatever, who, be sure and jump in, because there's plenty of room and there was plenty of disagreement. Well, there were 3, maybe 4 men named James in the Greek scriptures in the New Testament. The first one is a man named James, the son of Zebedee. And I'm sure most of us remember James and John. Here's a little bit about James that I was able to glean out of the scriptures. Mark 1:19. I got to move something here. I can't see. Okay. Mark 1:19, and this is a little later in Jesus Christ's ministry, when he was going toward Jerusalem from up north. It says, and when he had gone a little farther, he saw James. I'm sorry, I have that scripture in a minute. This is when he called James and John. He saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. So John also is the son of Zebedee, who were in the ship mending their nets. So they were fishermen. And these 2 men were 2 of the 12 disciples. And in Mark 3:17, this is what I was alluding to a minute ago. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, is another way of saying, both of them are sons of Zebedee. And he surnamed them Boanerges. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. which means the sons of thunder. And we know that Jesus called them the sons of thunder because of their fiery personality. And at one point, the one area that we know where they were a little fiery, pun intended, they wanted to call down fire from heaven on this Gentile town that didn't accept Jesus. In Luke 9, it says they didn't receive him because his goal was to get to Jerusalem. He wasn't going to stay. He wasn't going to, preach in this town. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, let us wipe these people out. Let us bring fire down from heaven like Elijah did. And, these were a couple of pretty rough guys. They were colorful characters, apparently. They wouldn't back away from a confrontation or a fight. In fact, they might have even looked forward to one. They could be very aggressive, and they could also be insensitive. This James was the first apostle to be martyred. Now remember, we're going to be talking about at least 3 Jameses. This one was apparently the first one to be martyred. Now this is another area where everybody doesn't agree. Some say that it was one of the other Jameses that was martyred first, but the consensus that I found was it was James, the son of Zebedee, one of the sons of thunder, who was martyred first. Now, dates for his martyrdom run from the late 40s until the early 60s. I mean, they're all over the place, just like, so much of the information that we get from 2,000 years ago. It's hard to get everybody on the same page, but the majority of the sources that I found say he died in the late 40s. And that's a fairly important date. Remember that. Oh, it's not a date, but a time period. Late 40s. And as such, this would have been too early for him to have written this epistle. This epistle was written after the late 40s. I'll get to the date here in a few minutes. Right now. Most scholars date this letter to be early to mid 50s. So they say that James, the son of Zebedee, died too early to have written this letter. Verse 12:1, this is talking about the execution. It says, about that time, Herod was vexing the church, was giving the church a lot of trouble, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So that's a little bit about, let's just call him James 1, James the son of Zebedee. The next James we're going to talk about is James the son of Alphaeus. He was also called James the Less. He was also called James the Younger. Now, technically, the name or the moniker, the Less, is only used once in the scriptures. It's in Mark 15:40, and I've got that down here a little bit later. But early Christians, they say, used this term to distinguish which James they were talking about. We have last names today, surnames, if you will. And they didn't use surnames too much back then. Some did. So they used the term James the Less or James the Younger to recognize who they were talking about. He was one of the prominent disciples. And it could mean that he was younger, shorter, or less significant. I'm sorry, he wasn't one of the most prominent. Now, here's a little bit about this James the son of Alphaeus, or James the Less. There's not much written about him. He's mentioned 4 times. Well, he's mentioned 5 times, but he's one time it's his mother that was mentioned. But the 4 times that he is mentioned were all 4 times when the disciples were named. And he's just named as one of the disciples. And here's one of the places. Philip and Matthew is naming off the disciples. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. He may have been the brother of another disciple, Matthew, who was also known as Levi. It says, as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son, this is Jesus passing by. He saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of custom. Matthew, the son of Alphaeus. Now, there could have been more than one Alphaeus, but this at least makes you want to think, okay, it's possible that James the Less and Matthew were brothers. Matthew rose up and followed him. Now, some of the commentaries said that he was Jesus's first cousin. Now, I use that terminology. Some people say cousin first, second cousin once removed or whatever. I never have gotten into those removed cousin things. We just call them first cousin. If your mom and dad are brothers and sisters, if not your mom and dad, if your mom has a sister or a brother, their children are your first cousins. And no, it's not your mom and dad or brother and sister. So his mother is mentioned at the crucifixion. There were also women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the son of James the Less. So he's mentioned here, but through his mother, who was at the crucifixion site. And that's about all we know about James, the son of Alphaeus. James the Less.
Yep.
Yes, Barb?
Is this James and the apostle?
Yes, this James is an apostle.
Okay.
What was that last scripture that you mentioned about at the cross? Which one was that?
That's this one that's up, Mark 15:40. There were also women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary Magdalene. I don't have the whole concept here. Context, Mark.
James the Less.
Yep. And the scriptures don't tell us why he was called the Less. The commentaries just said, this was a way that they distinguished between them. And, the other James would certainly have made a bigger splash, if you will. So he's also called James the Younger.
So far we have James the son of Alphaeus, and James the Less.
James the Less and James the Alphaeus, same person.
Okay.
We have James the son who? James. Somebody help me here. My brain's gone crazy.
Zebedee. The first one was son of Zebedee.
Zebedee. Thank you, dear.
So I've got some Baker Encyclopedia says James the son of Alphaeus and James Less are different, but who knows? It was 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And does it matter?
Yeah. I found the same things, Mark, as I was going through this thing. There's a lot of disagreement about, who's who. And, as you know, all you can do is the best you can do. And it seems like the consensus that I found was that they were two different people. However, I'm sorry, they were the same person. We don't know. And like you say, it's probably not that important. It isn't. It will be nice to kind of have a good feeling about who wrote this letter, which the next one I'm going to talk to hopefully is going to, it's not going to nail it down, but it'll give us a little more information. The third James that we're going to talk about is James the Just, who was the brother, half brother of Jesus Christ. So the third James that we're going to talk about was the half brother of Jesus Christ, and he's one of the he's the one that most of the scholars, and you know, that word may be an interesting word, but let's go with it. Most of the commentaries attribute James, the brother of Christ, to be the one who wrote this letter. Now, one of the interesting things about him is that during his lifetime, while he was growing up with Jesus, and even up to the crucifixion, he probably did not believe that his brother was the Messiah. He was not converted. He didn't buy the story at all. John 7:5 says, "For neither did his brethren believe in him," his brothers. Now, you could stretch that out and say, well, his brethren were all of these, you know, was everybody. But no, I don't think, I think the context here, and I'm sorry I don't have it, but his brothers did not believe in him. But then in Galatians, Paul says this, "I didn't see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." So he was an apostle. So he became converted. He not only became converted, but he became one of the leaders. Well, he became an apostle of Jesus Christ. And some of the commentaries said this, that there was an event that occurred that may have, they probably said probably, but I don't like using that word, that may have been the catalyst to begin his conversion. And that's in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, Jesus was buried. He rose again the third day according to the scriptures. He was seen by Peter, then of the 12. Okay, so he's been seen by all of the disciples. After that, he was seen by more than 500 people, of whom a lot of them are dead. But then verse 7 brings out James separately. After that, he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. And it's said up here in verse 5 that he was seen of the 12. The commentaries were saying this is a separate event, that he saw his brother, and that was the catalyst that created him moving in the right direction of believing in his brother as the Messiah. Now, it should be noted, and I'm going back to a previous scripture, you know, because we talked about James and John. It should be noted that this guy that wanted to call down fire from heaven and was pretty rough and tumble guy, he was the guy that wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote John 1, 2, and 3, and he wrote the book of Revelation. So John, the son of Zebedee, certainly became converted. He was an apostle, and his brother James was also an apostle. Okay, then to carry on talking a little bit more about the brother of Christ, in Galatians, Paul again says, well, not again, but he talks about him again. He says, when James, Peter, and John, who seem to be pillars. Now, this is at the Jerusalem conference. They seem to be pillars of the church in Jerusalem. Perceived the grace that was given to me, Paul. They gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship. Because if you remember, Paul wasn't welcome a lot of places. But when these three leaders of the Jerusalem church gave him the right hand of fellowship and gave him a job to do that God had put on their hearts through the Holy Spirit, that we should go to the Gentiles and that they, Peter and John, should go to the Jews, to Israel, to the circumcision. Now, you read about a lot of stuff in the history books and things, even though, like Mark said, it was 2,000 years ago. But here's something that I found that was at least worth mentioning. Whether it's true or not, we have absolutely no idea. But here's what I can't remember who wrote this. But anyway, an early history of the church was that once James, the brother of Christ, was converted, he became a follower with great devotion. Now, I'm not going to argue with that. But then it goes on, and, a little speculation here. It says James was such a man. Yes. Okay. It says James was such a man of prayer that his knees had large and thick calluses, making them look like the knees of a camel. Now, that may be a little bit of a stretch, but it's a way to say how dedicated James, the brother of Christ, became and how prayerful he was. Now, it goes on to say that he was pushed off a high point of the temple but didn't die. So then they beat him to death. And we use those three little words again. We don't know. We don't know if any of that is true or not. But what we can glean is that James, the brother of Christ, became a real leader in the Church of God in Jerusalem. Okay. Back to the Jerusalem conference, we have another scripture about, there were, you can imagine what was going on in this place. People not agreeing, people saying the Gentiles need to observe the law in order to be saved, and people saying, no, the Gentiles don't have to do that, and blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. So James told them, hey, hold it. I've got something to say. And after they'd held their peace, James, the brother of Christ, answered and said, okay, listen, you guys are going to have to listen to me. So he went on and gave his conclusion to the matter that had come from God through God's Holy Spirit. Simeon has declared how God at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. It was always God's plan for the entire world to come to him and to come to his son. It was always the plan. In verse 15, to this agree the words of the prophets. And in verse 16, it talks about I'm coming back and I'm going to set up the temple and build it up again. Now, this may be talking about the millennium. It may be talking about prior to the millennium. We don't really know. That the residue of men, that's everybody that hasn't been converted, right? The residue of men, everybody might seek after the Lord. Now, this is what James, the brother of Christ, is saying at the Jerusalem conference. Known to God are all his works from the beginning of the world, speaking of Christ. Wherefore, my sentence, here's what I say about this. We don't trouble the Gentiles that they have to observe the law, quote, in order to be saved. And those are such important words when you talk about that, which from among the Gentiles are turned to God, okay? Just like us, they don't have to observe the law in order to be saved. Nobody has to observe the law in order to be saved. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be observing the law. It just means that salvation is not a part of it. Anyway, but in verse 20, he goes on. He says, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to write them, and we're going to tell them that they must abstain from pollutions of idols. Don't worship idols. Don't go to the temple and have sex with temple prostitutes. Don't eat things strangled, and don't drink blood. Now, if you look at verse 20, and we've talked about this before, what he's saying is, tell those Gentiles to quit going to the temple, because that's where all this stuff happens. And that's basically what they were told after the Jerusalem conference. Don't go into the temple because you're going to end up worshiping idols, maybe having sex with the temple prostitutes, eating foods that haven't been cleaned right, and from drinking blood. And then verse 21 says, for Moses of old time has in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. So that was the final decision, and guess who gave it? The brother of Christ. He was a very important man in the early church. He was highly regarded. He was a good leader. Now, with that said, the scholars are not all in agreement about who wrote this letter. However, all of them say James wrote it. They just don't agree on which James it was. Sorry, I had to throw that little tidbit in there. Most of the commentaries that I checked believe it was written by James, the Lord's brother. I think I've said that before. Here's what one commentary said. The author of this epistle is known as James the Great, not James the brother of John and the son of Zebedee. This is the James who had a major role in the leadership of the early church. He presided over the council called to settle the dispute about Gentile converts. So the consensus, not everyone, but the consensus is that this was James, the Lord's brother, the pastor of the Jerusalem church, who was the author of the letter entitled James. Now, those are the three that we read about in the Greek scriptures in the New Testament. Anybody got anything to add to that? That's about all I could find on. Okay, so another consensus.
Arthur's got something.
Yeah, Mark.
Arthur's got something.
Oh, I'm sorry, Arthur.
No, Mark didn't have the sound turned on. Just one thought on a broader context. There's so very little we actually know about how the New Testament came together. And I've done quite a great deal of study on this point. We have to accept the text as it is and the order of which it is, but there's so little known about this part of the 2nd century. Chronologically, about 120 to 150 AD is when these books came together, and I can cite Lightfoot and how we got the Bible. It's a very interesting. Now, what I'm saying here does not take away from its validity, okay? But it's just that there's so little known in history actually as to how these books came together and the order. And one tiny little thing to illustrate the point. After the book of Acts, we have the book of Romans. But when was Romans written? It was way back when Paul was in Rome and a prisoner. And so chronologically, why did it come when it did in the order of the Bible? I think you'll find that it was the longest treatise or writing that was considered the most important, and the length of the actual books goes down in order of length.
Well, I want to add to that. I have here one of my Bibles is one that was it's called the Holy Bible in its original order, and it does have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then Acts, then James, then Peter, John, and all that, and Romans is back further, and it's in its chronological order. And reading it that way makes it a whole lot easier to get everything, to follow the story better. And from what I understand in reading the things that went along with this, the commentary that's in this Bible about why it was put in this, why it was changed, is the early Catholic Church wanted Romans to have the preeminence, and because that's there, and because also James seemed to uphold the law, and that was something they weren't for. They, we know, considered this the epistle of straw. They didn't like it, so they wanted to put it further in the back and give preeminence to Rome.
Yeah, what's the source of that Bible? What's the name of it?
James Coulter. James Coulter wrote it, or put it together. And his commentaries are where it's come from.
Coulter. I'd like to make an observation about Acts 15, or a couple of them. My personal history, strongly states that, just my history states that this section was used extensively to support a central leader of a corporate church. I think Arthur is nodding his whole body.
Sorry.
So it was used heavily by the Worldwide Church of God, and I don't know how CGI looked at it, and I'm not saying this because hopefully there are other people on this Bible study other than folks that come out of that history. I just want to make the observation that this is used very heavily to show a church hierarchy, control. My sentence is, and in fact, I think you could send it right back to the translation of the King James Version. And one of the purposes, again, of one of their goals was to support the king and support the church hierarchy. And so instead of saying, my decision is, it's using the word, a derivative of the form of krino, which we were talking about last week, judgment, which means a decision or a rendering or a thinking, and I can easily translate or put the setting and saying James was listening. He was one of the people listening, and he said, "Hey guys," just like Skip said, "I've got a view on this," and he stated what it was, and that made sense. After all, Peter. The whole thing of going to the Gentiles was introduced to the assembly, to the believers, the church, by Peter through a great dream that he had that people like to wrongly use. But the point is that he realized that God had opened up salvation, understanding, and welcoming of people into the belief of God and the family of God far beyond the nation of the Jews. And in fact, as you already said, this was always the goal. You will find this in the Old Testament where it talks about the Gentiles, it's the nations. That's all Gentiles means, is the nations.
Yeah.
But the point is that Peter had already introduced this to the church and had already practiced it. And the other thing I was going to say about Acts 15, and which you said, summed it up and said, hey, tell these folks not to go into these pagan temples and do the things that they do. You know what he's basically, I will boil it down further. He's saying you don't do this because you're going to be worshiping false gods who were the ones, the Elohim, who are in charge of these nations that we're going to. Stop doing that and accept the real God as the God. And I think we're going to find James is saying, you know, prove your belief by what you do. That's what we're going to find in this book. Prove your belief that the God is the God of all the universe by how you live and what you do. I'm done.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis of the book. So I'm pretty much done. Anybody got any questions?
Amen to what?
Good
Yeah,
job.
amen.
Do we have any idea how, obviously he has to be at least second in the family, but do we have any idea how old John was relative to Jesus? I mean, obviously he's younger, but
You mean James?
yes, I'm sorry.
You know, if you go by the Catholic definition, he wasn't a brother at all. I don't subscribe to that. I don't know. You know, you would think, you know, after Jesus was born, they fled to Egypt. Does anybody remember how long they were there? They were there till Herod died.
Yeah, and we don't know if anybody else came back with him or not, right? I mean,
Right.
if there were kids born in Egypt or not.
Yeah. You know, that's one of those things we don't know.
The reason that came to mind was typically you don't have, well, like in the Levitical priesthood, or you don't have anybody in the real leadership position within church, synagogue, whatever, until they are, what, 30 years old? If memory serves me right.
I think that's right.
And so I was just, you know, probably doesn't matter at all for this, but just wondering if he was 30 or not.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know.
I'd like to piggyback a little bit on what Mark opined about the meaning of the book of James when boiling it down to that comment he made about proving what you believe and what you understand so that you can do it. This is something that I've lectured to my kids a lot. You know, I used to tell them, I said, just because you guys are raised in the church and you guys went to church camps and you did all of these things growing up, does not mean that you're going to still retain and keep what it is that God is showing you. You have to prove what you understand, that it is, you know, the word of God, that these principles and these things that God is giving us in his word is legitimate and true, or you're going to be easily carried away by every wind of doctrine or get wrapped up in specific things that actually detract God's ability to actually teach you and open your mind up to understanding things more perfectly. And that's something that, you know, we have to keep in mind. I think is very important. I think that's what hopefully we'll learn more as we get into James, of these practical things that are built upon the law and built upon the principles of what God's laying down for us, so that, you know, we have to understand and know what we believe rather than just taking someone else's word for it. And I'm looking back, you know, at my own time in the Church of God, and I can't tell you, myself included, how much of my belief ended up being rooted in what other people wrote in booklets, what other people spoke from the pulpit. And some of it, quite frankly, was was bogus. It wasn't exactly what God said. It was someone's own interpretation. So understanding what we believe and why we believe it, I think, is a very important lesson to take out of this. And thank you, Mark, for bringing that up.
Yeah, I'll second that. Mark and Arthur, even though Arthur didn't say anything, but his whole body was shaking, so he was in effect saying the same. The hierarchy that many of us came up under was really abused a lot of people. Now, I can say I wasn't abused by that, but I was very fortunate. But so many people were, and I watched people when the hierarchy collapsed, if you will, when the head of the hierarchy turned out to be a human being, which was a shock to so many people. A lot of people left their belief. Some of them left believing in God completely. Many of them developed a hatred for the ministry that was ordained down through that hierarchical system, even though a lot of those ministers were good. We got two of them on here now. Were good men and didn't abuse people. So I was not aware, though, Mark, that was used, that James's speech, if you will, was used to help set up the hierarchy that we saw.
It didn't help set it up. It helped to solidify it and make it, say that it was a biblical thing.
Okay. Yeah.
And, that's the point that I made.
Yeah.
Arthur's got something he wants to say.
All right.
Yeah, I started this journey in 1963, and it was only about 5 years ago that the aha hit me about church organization and structure, especially when you look about there's 400 different splits since Herbert W. Armstrong died. And it's a very personal and individual journey we are on. And I was talking to a friend this morning who I used the expression because he's involved with a certain organization, but he's got differences of opinion about some doctrines. And there's another person putting a website up which is interactive. And he said, well, I can't put it up on there because I can't teach this at the church that I'm attending. And I didn't do the Hail Mary on him. But I said, well, you're fulfilling the German expression, a person sitting between two stools. It's awkward. And once you come to the conclusion that the organization that we've all been a part of to one degree or another over the years is just an organization. My brother's in the United COG, Church of God, okay, and I was in United. Who's right? They can't both be the Church of God and the only Church of God. So I came to the conclusion this organization thing is just simply wrong. And it's who you are and what you are in the way you think, the way you live your life, the way you behave, in every way that you follow the scriptures in the intent that it means to love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's difficult for people who have had this ingrained in them about, your leader comes straight from God and everything that he says is gospel. And, sorry, that's just not right. And I know some of you will find this hard to believe, but everything I say is not right. I know that's a difficult one for, especially Diane, to believe.
I'm leaving.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's some interesting stuff. Thanks, guys.
I was listening to Ron Dart, a couple of his, actually, I just think they were radio programs, where, when he says, upon this rock I will build this church, nobody asked him what church meant. And his comment on it was, they read that, and the word means like assembly or group, or he said that likely the disciples didn't ask him about that because they viewed that as the entire congregation of Israel. And, and church had never been mentioned before. But it was clear that he was building a new church.
Yeah.
Not out of the old wineskins, but a new wineskin. But clearly not the hierarchical structure. Just wasn't there.
Yeah, and speaking of Ron, I know I may Ron you all to death a little bit too much, but he has a sermon that you can get called Self-Directed Christian, and he starts off with this statement: are you led by the church, or are you led by the Spirit? And he goes on and he says, you better be led by the Spirit, because we know what can happen to a church. And this was said shortly after 1995. So anyway, it's a good sermon, and it's right along the lines of what Mark and Arthur and Michael and James were, have been talking about. Okay, so this letter was written in the early 50s. That's the consensus again. And there's a reason that I'm going to say my next sentence. Paul's first letter to the Galatians was written about then too, but the rest of Paul's letters were written much later and were written after James, the brother of Christ, had been killed, had died. So where a lot of people say that James wrote this to counter what Paul was saying, number one, James didn't have to counter what Paul was saying. They were saying the same things. It's just people twist, if you will, Paul's words and make him say things that he didn't say. But this letter was written probably even before Galatians. Now, I know Ken didn't mention Galatians first, but if you look at the northern and the southern theories of when the letter to the Galatians was written, the southern makes a lot more sense to me because it was written before the Jerusalem conference, and a lot of that was talked about at the Jerusalem conference. But James was probably written before even Galatians was written. So when
add to that, Skip.
Yeah.
In the notes in this book, it says that James was written in 40 to 41 AD, and then after that, 1 Peter and then 1 John was in 63 AD. And so in the chronological order here, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, then James, and then 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st through 3 John, then Jude, then Romans.
I'm talking about Galatians.
And then Galatians is, and then it's Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and then Galatians is after Corinthians.
Yeah, well, sorry, I don't buy that for a minute. Because I've studied quite a bit about the northern and southern theories of when Galatians was written, And I believe Galatians was written, but anyway, that's another issue. I think Galatians was written much, much, much earlier than what Coulter says, I believe. But, you know, he can have his belief and I can have mine. Okay, so this letter was written in the late 40s or early 50s, or in the 40s anyway. So here's the next question. Who did James write the letter to? Now, this is a kind of an interesting discussion here on who did he write it to. And here's verse 1. And this is the only verse we're going to look at today that's in James, I think. He says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Notice he doesn't say he's an apostle, because he's not. This is the brother of Christ. The consensus is. He wrote it to, quote, the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Well, that makes it simple. He wrote it to the 12 tribes which were scattered abroad. So, okay, let's just move on, right? Well, there's a lot in those few words there. Much has been said and written about those 12 tribes that James mentions. Now, those of you who were in the Worldwide or one of the splits or whatever will remember that this scripture was used to support the British Israelism theory and so on. And I'm not arguing with that. I'm not praising that. I'm just saying that's not what my subject is right here. So James wrote this letter to the 10 tribes that were the northern tribes and the 2 tribes that were the southern tribes. 10 and 2 is 12. So without getting into the British Israelism theory, we have to address James's comment. So who are these 12 tribes? And those of you who've been around a long time are you know, you can go get a cup of coffee or something, because I'm going to be going over some stuff that you've heard ad nauseum. Most Christians and even researchers and historians and so on, when speaking of Jacob's descendants or Israel's descendants, mention the word Jews, and they stop there. You know, well, the Jews did this, or the Jews believed this, or the Jews were here, the Jews were there. Well, the term Jew, as I'm sure most everybody knows, comes from the name of the tribe or family, if you will, of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. So Israel and Jacob are interchangeable, but Judah and Israelite are not interchangeable. A Jew is part of the Israelite family, but isn't all of the Israelite family. Jacob had 11 other sons and 1 daughter that are called Israel. Now, he had more children, but I'm not getting into that. I'm just talking about the 12 right now. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. David and Jesus Christ are from the tribe of Judah. Moses and Aaron were from the tribe of Levi, and so on. I mean, we can go through and we could find people throughout the Bible or the New Testament that came from this tribe or that tribe, this family or that family. So when James mentions the 12 tribes, he's not just talking about Jews. He's talking about the descendants of Jacob, known as Israel, all 12. And this letter, like many of Paul's, and this is my opinion, seems to be one that James wanted circulated among lots of different groups, lots of different churches, specifically to the areas where descendants of Jacob lived, the 12 tribes, part of the 12 tribes. Now, we don't know where or how James planned for this letter to be circulated, but verse 1 pretty much tells us, I'm writing this to the 12 tribes, so get it around. Now, one thing I think we need to consider is that this letter was written to Christians and non-Christians who were of the 12 tribes. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't written to any Gentiles. It's just that he didn't talk about that in this letter. This letter seems to have been written to the family of Jacob. It doesn't mean other people can't read it and can't learn from it, can't listen, and so on. But it was not just written to the Jews, because that's just one of the 12. Now, since it was obviously written to Christians and non-Christians, there, in the family of Jacob, there must have been some churches that were scattered around the world at this time. Well, this is early. Before Paul, I think even before Paul's conversion. I'd have to check those dates, but it was certainly no, I don't think it was. I think maybe he had gone on his first missionary journey, which was to the southeastern part of Asia Minor, Iconium.
Well, that is correct, because that's the whole reason for the, quote, conference in Jerusalem, was because people had been went down and accused Paul and Silas, Barnabas of, doing certain things in Antioch, and they went up to Jerusalem to talk to the apostles. So yes, Paul was well and truly into his journeys.
Yeah. Date-wise, I think maybe just the first, but the first is where all of this was coming from for the Jerusalem conference, wasn't it?
I think it may have been the second, without going to Acts and looking.
Oh, really?
But anyway.
May I make one other chronological comment?
No, you've already talked enough, Arthur.
Everything I said was true, though.
That's true.
A small part of importance is that when the northern 10 tribes seceded in the south, in the north, and left Judah, there was also Benjamin. The tribe of Benjamin was there, and some Levites. So when we use the term Jew in a holistic way like that, it actually includes Benjamin and some Levites who were serving in the priesthood there. Okay, I'm done.
Right.
Now, I think you may be right. I think it may be after the first one. Pretty sure it was the first trip.
We know at least it was after the first trip, so whether he'd gone on, I don't know, but it's obvious it was after the first trip, because if you go back and you look, even though there's only one scripture, I think, in that whole section that talks about Paul and Barnabas, but it talks about everybody was listening to Paul and Barnabas. Well, why? Because they had been to Galatia, where this question came up. So I think they had a big part in what was going on and what was being said in Jerusalem during the conference. That's just my opinion. But anyway, now the ESV Study Bible says this, and I don't always agree on everything these guys, but I throw it out as another way to look at something, or a way to look at something. The ESV Study Bible says the Epistle of James was likely written to predominantly Jewish Christian house churches outside of Palestine. Well, I'm sorry, it was written to 12, not 1. But anyway, based on its mention of the 12 tribes in the dispersion. So the ESV Study Bible takes the same approach that so many people do, that the Jews are it, all 12. All 12 tribes are Jews. Well, they're not. It says this would mean it was sent throughout most of the ancient Mediterranean world. I don't have a problem with that. As a matter of fact, I'll show you this map while we're talking. The author has traditionally been believed to be James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus and an early leader of the church in Jerusalem. And I think that is probably correct. But the key that we need to remember is this letter was written not to just people living in Jerusalem and not written to just people from the tribe of Judah. It was written to all of Jacob's descendants, if you will, all of Israel's descendants. And here is a map of a lot of those churches that Paul seeded. But what we were talking about a minute ago, what Mark and I were talking about is, oops, I didn't mean to move that, is that the first missionary journey was just in this area right here. If you see the word Iconium, Lystra, Perga, Pisidia, Antioch, that was this area right here. And this is the area which I believe, and Ken, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump on you a while ago. I believe that the Southern Galatian theory would be the letter was written to these churches here, not these up here, which is the Northern theory, which is much later. And it would have been after the Jerusalem conference. And I just don't see how that works, but that's just my opinion. We know that Paul was very much aware of what was going on here, and apparently James was very much aware of what was going on here. After all, he was involved in the conference down here in Jerusalem. So anyway,
I've got we can go somewhere else and learn more about some of the places that this letter was to go. So yes, we agree that the 12 tribes, wherever they were, we also know that the 12 tribes were intermixed, at least partially, with Jews, because Paul was of Benjamin, correct? Is that right?
That's right.
And if we go back to Acts chapter 2, verse 9 through 11, it tells us where people were from when they came to Jerusalem to worship on the day of Pentecost. And keep your map there. I don't know if you can keep both of them there, or maybe you hold the map and I'll read it. It says Parthians and Medes. You may not have all of these up.
Yeah, I was going to go look for that, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, Parthians and Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretians and Arabians. So all of this relates back somewhat to a couple of different things. This was the known world at that time. And we can even expand it by looking in Genesis chapter 11 or 10 about the spreading, God dispersing the nations. So we know that, number one, that there were people at Pentecost from the places that were mentioned. And we find that many names are mentioned also in the spreading of the nations by God when we have the Tower of Babel incident. God's purpose was to go everywhere, and apparently there were lots of people, or there were little pockets of people dispersed among the nations where these representatives that are these people who came to Pentecost were going back. He wanted the truth spread back to them. And of course, James is duplicating that. We find in certain other places of Paul's writing where he even was determined to go to Tarshish, which was Spain.
Mhm.
So all of these places are both part of the dispersion that James mentions and ultimately where God wanted to go, where God wanted people to go, which is now everywhere.
Yeah, great point. And you know, this dispersion, there was more than one dispersion. There was one dispersion that happened in, what was it, 700 BC, when the Assyrians came down and captured the northern 10 tribes. And we find no evidence that all of those people ever came back to Jerusalem. So they're spread out through the world. And then in 300 or so, Babylon came down and captured the southern 2 tribes. Well, it was 3 actually, because Levi was part of that. It was Judah and Benjamin and you know, a lot of priests. So those people were scattered throughout the world. Now, I don't know if that's what James had in mind when he says this, but he did say the 12 tribes scattered. So then when Paul was persecuting the Jews in Jerusalem, there was a dispersion. And then earlier than that, what you were just talking about, on the day of Pentecost, those people went back home. So didn't God tell Abraham that his descendants would be as the sands of the sea and as the stars in the sky? That's a whole bunch of folks. And the 14 million Jews or whatever that are in Palestine don't fit that bill. And then New York City has about that many, if I'm not mistaken. So
Even when the Jews were taken captive to Babylon, that wasn't all of them. Lots of the people in the rural areas were just left. They destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and they took the higher classes. They left a lot of the people. And then when they came back from Babylon, most of the people did not go back to Jerusalem.
right.
They stayed in Babylon.
Yeah. And it would have been the same thing with the northern tribes when some of them went back. Not everybody went back. So you know, there are Israelites spread throughout this world today. We may be descendants. Who knows? I know what the Church of God taught, and I'm not getting into that, but
Well, that's a good point, Skip, in the sense that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that in one sense, because God wanted everyone to become His nation, His people.
mm-hmm.
Every believer was to be one of His people, His persons in His family. So it is, the message is, let's get it out everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, effectively, we're all descendants now of Abraham. I mean, we've been grafted into that.
Yeah. People in the church, yes.
Yeah, and which predates all of Israel.
Right.
But you know, I have a problem thinking that James did not know. I mean, I think that James had some idea where the 12 tribes were because he wrote a letter to them. And he seems so direct in the things that he says. You know, I can't think that he wasn't aware to some extent of where the, so to speak, lost 10 tribes were.
That's very possible. Yeah, very possible.
May I point out, I think distinction of which tribes anyone may belong to is irrelevant when you consider that Abraham was a Gentile.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, and you know, if you look at his homeland, up until Saddam Hussein, there was a very large population of Jews still in Iraq.
Okay. Then let me add this on to what we're talking about. You know, we can look forward to things that we think are going to happen based on the scriptures. Well, so could James, and so could John. I mean, those guys knew what the scriptures said. Now we have more scriptures than they did, but I can't help but think that James knew this letter was going to be read 1,000 years later. And guess what? It is 2,000 years later. It's circulated to us and to everybody that has a copy of the scriptures.
Think of all of the discussions that he must have overheard between his half brother and his mother over his lifetime.
Yeah.
You know, eventually, when he becomes converted, that stuff starts to coalesce.
Yeah, you know, Arthur mentioned the aha moment a while ago. You know that James, who apparently didn't believe his brother was the Messiah till after the resurrection, that was a heck of an aha moment. And yeah, it makes plenty sense that all of that stuff started. You know, well, my goodness, you know, all of those little cliches and things. So Christian Israelites are reading this letter. They may not know they're Israelites, and they may be only 1/10,000th of a percent Israelite, or 1/10,000th of a percent Indian. Never mind. I'm sorry, sarcasm. They may not know they're descendants of Jacob, but they're still in the world today. They are, as God told Abraham. I mentioned this a minute ago. The number is the sands of the sea. Now, some have taken the position that James wrote this letter to combat the writings of Paul. I think I mentioned that a minute ago. That would have been a little hard to do based on the dates that we think this was done. Okay, so I'm about to change directions here. Does anybody want to add anything to what's gone on up to this point?
Skip, I just add something to you, and it doesn't really matter, but looking at the chronology from AD 30 AD to 70 AD, it says that, and I think this goes along in agreement with what you're saying, that Paul, in this index in the back of this book, says Paul writes the epistle to the Galatians from Antioch in late spring 53 AD.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's just in chronological order as the way things were played out on the ground, and not so much that it was written at a certain time.
Okay,
I
got you. Yeah,
is that reading the book, the Gospels, and then Acts, and then James, and then the other ones right after it plays out. There's so much between Acts and James that correlate that they read better when they're together.
Okay, gotcha. Not necessarily when it was written, but how it plays out. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm about to go on a rabbit chase, folks. So you all better slow me down, jump in here, and say what you want to say, because it's going to be too late here in just a minute. I'm going to count to 10 to myself, and then we're going to start chasing a rabbit. All right, here we go. As you will remember, I started off saying that James did not write this letter. Now I'm going to show you why I said that. And I want to lead off with a big, it doesn't matter. But it is interesting to me. Okay. The first word in James 1, oops, that's the Jewish, is James, the name of the man who wrote the book. Now, you wouldn't think there'd be much to talk about the man's name, but guess what? There is. There's something to be said about this name. And it's one of the first things that jumped out at me when I began my research to come up with this little crazy intro for today. The Greek for James may not even be James. I was kind of, it was a trick statement that the Greek may be a different name. Now I'll pause for a minute and let that sink in. James may not be the correct name. It's the correct person, I believe, but maybe not the correct name. All right. Now, with that in mind, I went back, I looked at the Greek definitions, and I also checked 22 translations that are in my word search Bible program. All but one translated his name as James. So 21 out of 22 translations translated it James. Let's talk about the Greek. The Greek word translated James is Iacobos. Iacobos. Say that real fast. Iacobos. It's a word that has a Hebrew origin, and it comes from Yaakov. Say that fast. Yaakov. Jacob. So I thought, well, how do our Jewish friends translate it in the complete Jewish Bible? Well, they don't translate names. They leave them in their Hebrew form, even though, they're translating the Greek scriptures. From Yaakov, a slave of God, and so on. Yaakov. Who does that sound like? What does that sound like? Jacob. Now, the Bible Knowledge Commentary said this: James was actually Jacob. It is not certain why the English translators chose James rather than Jacob. James, Jake, and Jacob all come from the same root. Bible translations in other languages tend to utilize the transliterated name, which is James, from the actual Hebrew of Jacob. And then they add they add what I think is a kind of a dumb statement, but it's here. Could it be that King James desired to see his name in the English translation he authorized? I don't buy that for a minute, but anyway. So their comment about King James hopefully was a sarcastic comment or a joke or something. I can't imagine for a minute that that's how it happened. But the general consensus of all the commentaries that mention this translation was that this Greek word and its Hebrew counterpart could either be translated Jacob or James. So it's not that this is a bad translation. It is one of two translations that you could use. So now, can you imagine, here we are 30, 40, 50 years after deep study in the scriptures, that you now need to get in the habit of calling this book Jacob? I think not. Or speak of a letter in the New Testament and call it Jacob. That's what I'm saying. You want to call the son of Isaac, you want to start calling him James? You could. You want to start calling this book Jacob? You could. So old habits die hard, and I move that we stick with the way that it's been translated all these many years. I just wanted to make the note that this word could be translated either way. Has anybody ever heard that before? Because I had not before I started studying this.
I guess the only thought that popped in my head, Skip, as you were going through all of this, and I appreciate the time that you're taking to go through it, is for me personally, I'm less concerned about how we pronounce the name or what its root is. I'm more interested in what is being said in the book rather than exactly who wrote it, exactly when it was writing, because the principles that are being discussed in here are timeless. They're inspired by God, and that's what's more important. So that's just my 2 cents there.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%. I think the one thing in this whole hour and a half or whatever that we've talked about this, the most important thing is that Jesus Christ's brother, it seems, wrote this letter. And I think we ought to give it a whole lot of credence when you think about that. And when you think about the things, as Mark said earlier, the synopsis of this book is, how are we supposed to live, and all of that, all of that, which we'll get into beginning next week. And there's no contradiction between James' approach to his understanding of faith and grace and obeying. There's no difference between his and Paul's. And so many people want to start a fight between the two. And wasn't it Martin Luther that called this the Epistle of Straw? He didn't like it. He didn't like it at all, because James talks about, hey, we ought to be doing something to show that we're Christians. We don't just say we're Christians and stop there. We ought to be proving that we're Christians by the things that we do. And that's another, it's kind of what Mark was saying. That's the synopsis of this book, or a big part of it anyway. We believe in observing the Sabbath and the holy days and the things we understand about God and Christ that are very, very important to us. But the key to salvation is belief in Jesus Christ and accepting his blood. And then you do the things that you read in the scriptures that God says he wants you to do. So anyway, and I know, a lot of people think that Skip says you don't have to do anything. You don't have to observe the Sabbath. You don't have to, but you should, and you should want to. But it's not salvation. I'm going to get myself in trouble again there. But salvation comes through the blood of Christ. Okay, that's it for me for today. Any other thoughts, corrections, or Skip, you've lost your minds?
No, I enjoyed it.
Well, thanks.
Thanks for doing this, Skip. Appreciate it. I've enjoyed it.
Sure. I enjoy putting it together, and the stuff. And guys, I do chase a lot of rabbits every once in a while. The group that's been here for years knows that, and I have a lot of fun. But the rabbits that we chase are not the important thing.
Yeah, and I think maybe it might be a good idea to remember there's a lot of us here that, or some of us anyway, that was never in Worldwide and had very little contact with many of the Church of God organizations. So sometimes you guys get off on a tangent of chasing down who did what and who said what and who abused who, but all that's kind of goes over some of us as our we don't know anything about that. We'd rather just stick to a closer examination of scripture when possible.
Well,
I think that's a good point. That I'm not sure who made the point, but I think that's a great point. The only reason that I think that it gets mentioned from time to time, and hopefully it's time to time and not all the time, the only reason it gets mentioned from time to time is because there are residual understandings that those of us who were part of that have, and those things sometimes have to be corrected with new understandings about certain things. So appreciate your patience in helping us get through that.
yeah, and Mark's right. It is from time to time, and you are right that we certainly don't need to talk about that stuff all the time. Today had a couple of things in it that I think needed to maybe be explained a little bit, because I don't subscribe to some of the beliefs, many of the beliefs that the old worldwide taught. And I think most of the people here don't either. But this British Israelism thing was really important to them. And anyway, you are right, and I will certainly keep that in mind. But we don't do this, quite that often. As a matter of fact, we'll go through the rest of this letter, probably not mentioning anything about our history.
I want to add something. It's kind of interesting to know that. It's kind of trivial, but at the same time, I'd learned something from that about actually James' name actually being transliterated from Jacob. But I found this little article, and someone else has come across this. Someone is from BibleArchaeology.org, and this person was teaching on this, and it came across that. And so when I was teaching a course on New Testament general letters, introducing the book of Jacob, also known as the book of James, students were perplexed until they learned that Jacob is the proper translation of the Greek name Jacobus. And one student wrote later, knowing this, it turned my understanding of the writings upside down. Another observed that with the name change, the loss of the Jewish lineage occurs. So why was that important? Well, so how did the Jewish name Jacob become so gentilized as James? It started in the 14th century. John Wycliffe, which is one of the translators, basically this article said he did it. But however, in the both Old and New Testaments, he arbitrarily used the name Jacob in the other ones. So the future English translations, it's stuck. So when it says King James sponsored the translation, then called the Authorized Version, it's been called the King James Bible since. So why? It probably is because of that person sponsoring. King James sponsored this. It doesn't change the meaning of the book itself, but once again, it seems like there's such a leaning in the King James Bible and the original books of anything against Hebrew. I mean, anything that's quote, and we know Jewish is far more meaning than just the religion we know as Judaism, but it is such a strong lean against anything that has to do with the original Hebrew.
That's interesting, Ken. I've not ever looked. I even when I was going through this, I didn't look at it that way. That it gentilized, if you will, this name. I didn't really look at it that way. I just looked at it but the reason I didn't look at it that way is because I'm not anti-Jewish.
The writers of this translation were.
Yeah, that's
the early church fathers were very anti-Semite.
That could be true, and that's you all covered that Thursday night too, didn't you? In Mike's class.
Yeah, well, I don't remember. No, we didn't cover none of that.
In a way, because one of the questions was, why did the Jews deserve, or did the Jews deserve the holiday?
Yeah.
And of course, so many people believe that. But it's really nice, and I don't think anybody on here at all is anti-Jewish. We were very thankful for the Jews and for the other tribes, but the Jews is the one that gets talked about all the time.
Yeah, I think one of Ron Dart's quotes that stuck with me so strongly is this, and I hope I don't butcher this, and Dad, you can probably correct me if I say it wrong, but the Jewish Judaism is not God's religion. It is the Jewish people's reaction to the Tanakh, the Torah.
Yeah, you did a good job. That's pretty accurate.
Skip?
Yes, Arthur. Now listen, how many times are you going to talk today?
Only once more.
Okay.
Maybe. I'd like to recommend a book because we come into the scriptures without really the whole Bible, without really a background of the history, the chronological aspect, the linguistic aspect. And there's a great book out called Our Father Abraham by Wilson. And I highly recommend it. You can get it on half price books for about $10. It's a really very, very good historical book, which gives an understanding to the Bible. And I just would like to recommend it to the rest of you if you'd like to read it, because it puts things in context and makes things understandable. Okay.
What was it again?
Our Father Abraham, and it's by Wilson, Wilson.
Okay, I got to tell you, so people kid me about my accent all the time, especially if I leave Arkansas. But what I heard you say, the name of the book the first time was Alpha Abraham by Wilson.
I don't have an accent. You do. Our Father Abraham. Okay.
Alpha Abraham. I thought, is Alpha part of, or did he mess up and he just meant Abraham by Wilson?
And speaking of books, I'm gonna throw another one. You mentioned Galatians, and I could only read half of the book. It was so detailed, and I got the point. So, but it's called Galatians, a Torah-based commentary in first century Hebraic context, and it's by Avi ben Mordecai. So this is a gentleman who has obviously Jewish roots, but he is a Christian at this point in his life. But pretty much all of us have the understanding of the Galatians, and we understand the misunderstandings that Protestant world has about Galatians. But Galatians is given so much in the preeminence about anybody who says, "Oh, the law is done away with," you have the normal Protestant doctrine. And I understand Galatians and what Paul's saying, but he shines a better light on it by basically, it's a very long book for detail, but he's saying in there that most of what we see is Paul talking about the law. We understand it, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that he is speaking against the
Oral law.
The oral law, and the point of it being so detailed, but it's so much more clear. It's hard for me to explain it, but it makes it seem like he's actually the preeminence that the scribes had, that they took the place of God, and that they were putting so much stuff out there. Then it's put into Acts. We studied Acts and all that stuff about how you just got to do this, but they were made a law into their own selves. They became their own interpreters.
Yeah, and Paul dealt with, and you mentioned it a minute ago when you quoted Ron, but he dealt with the Judaizers, and Judaizers were Jews who believed that you're saved by observing the law. And, Paul was saying, And so, people take what Paul said having to do with being saved by observing the law as him saying the law's done away with, and that's not at all. Ken, John Wilson, what's the name of that book again?
It is Galatians, a Torah-based commentary in first century Hebraic context.
Did you get it, John?
Yeah, the author is Avi, A-V-I, Ben, B-E-N, Mordecai.
Okay.
This is a used book, and there's so few out there. I still paid. I think I paid $30 or $40 for it because there's like so few out there, and it's used. It's a lot of pages. It's 500 pages, and I'm not doing a very good job explaining why it's so much different. But it did help me understand a lot of the troubling scriptures. That it's not troubling, but it just I understand it more in depth about what Paul was talking about. Paul was coming out of a cult, you might say. I mean, it really was a cult.
Okay. Yeah, Jim.
I think the thing that we have to realize is that the Jewish religion of Jesus' day was not the religion of the Hebrew Scriptures.
Yeah.
Some of it was based on that, but it was entirely different. I mean, especially if you read the book of Judges and how people behaved then versus now.
There's a series out on Netflix that might not be out anymore, but it was only one season. It was called Unorthodox. Anybody heard of it or seen it?
Nope.
It is a series based on a book, but it follows. It's a true life book, but it's a book written about this woman's experience coming out of. She lived in New York City in an Orthodox Jewish sect, and it was about her life growing up there and how she was so sheltered, and that when I watched it, there was all these the women had to shave their head when they got married. The marriage bed was two separate beds, and it had all these weird things. And these young people were so sheltered in the middle of New York City that the women weren't able to read. They weren't allowed to go to school. They were, a lot of you know some of the Orthodox traditions, but my wife and I were watching it, and I'm the Bible scholar, so I was seeing these things, and I found myself going, well, the reason why they did this, and they had this odd custom, is because of this scripture, because that scripture. But you see how they're taking everything and making it literal. We know that they don't cut their hair in this area because of this verse, and we know that they wear these things on their forehead and on their wrist because of this verse, and they're taking it literally. But what my overall point was is it does such a disservice to the Bible, especially the Old Testament. That how do people who want to be Christians and do watch that and they go, I don't want nothing to do with the Old Testament because I don't want to live like that. And so that's my point, is that fortunately they've got these interpretations, these ideas that are really doing a lot of damage to the scriptures.
Yeah, Ken?
Yeah.
Y'all can hear me, right? I guess so, anyway.
I didn't hear anything.
This series called Unorthodox, I didn't see it. Let me preface this by saying that I would love to have seen it, but I didn't know that it was on. But there are so many different. If you start talking about Orthodox Judaism, there are so many different sects within that.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, if you go to New York City, I can't even begin to imagine how many different Orthodox sects there are. So just a thought that we should keep that in mind when we're talking about Orthodox Jews, because there are so many different kinds. What's that one called? See.
Hasidic?
Yeah, this is
No, not acidic, but that is one of them. But this is another one that.
Ashkenazi.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks, James.
This series is called Unorthodox, but here's the description: a Hasidic Jewish woman in Brooklyn flees to Berlin from an arranged marriage and is taken in by a group of musicians until her past comes calling. So she said Hasidic.
I see.
And they wear the hats that look like Russian fur hats, but they're big and broad, and they don't cut their beard, and they have locks, I guess you call it. But anyway, I'm not trying to put them down in the sense that, they're doing what they've been told to do from tradition after tradition, generation after generation. And they live in close-knit families. They all grow up in one building, but per se, I mean, they don't. Anyway, it's not putting them down, but in the sense that they have missing the point of the Torah.
Did you see, or has anybody? I know somebody's seen this besides me. Yentl, starring.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Barbara, huh?
I've seen it.
Yeah. I believe that is if I'm correct, an Hasidic Jewish group there. And I found that, now that was, you talk about an enlightening dissertation on what it was like to live and grow up and in a particular sect, Jewish sect. It was really good. For those who haven't seen it, you can rent it. Of course, Barbara Streisand is Jewish.
Enjoyed the conversation, guys. Y'all have a great Sabbath.
Okay, Ken.
Okay.
All right, that's all I've got. John, goodness gracious. Michael, did you get that prayer request on John Beasley?
About his
sister.
His sister, I did. I'll
Yeah.
put it up on the website later.
Okay, all right. Does anybody have any prayer requests? All right, if you do, send them to either me or Michael. I appreciate everybody being here and putting up with me. So next week, I guess we'll start with Jacob 1. Little humor there. James 1 next Sabbath. I assume everybody's going to. Well, some may be going down to the CFN Winter Tournament. We're not. Diane and I'll be here. So if you're not going to be here next Sabbath, let me know. If there's just 2 or 3 people, we might want to put it off a week. But let me know if you're planning on being here. So I guess that's it. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thanks a bunch. I'm going to take the recording.